Hello, welcome everybody to today's session. Thanks for joining us for this CrowdControlHQ user masterclass. Today, we're going to be looking at crisis management and how you can use some of the CrowdControlHQ platform features to help you manage a crisis. Why are we looking at social media crisis management? Well, the fact is every organization is actually vulnerable to a crisis, whether you're a business or a public sector organization. And as you know, you can't simply bury your head in the sand until it goes away. So what we're going to look at today is how you can be prepared and understand what to do if you find yourself in a crisis. So my name is Dan Aston. I'm the marketing manager here at CrowdControlHQ. I'm here with my colleague George, who I'm pretty sure most of you will know or have spoken with before.
Thanks for the intro, Dan. Hi, everybody. It is great to see so many familiar people on the webinar today. Thanks very much for joining, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you, George. So let's get straight into it. Before we start looking at the CrowdControlHQ platform, just wanted to take 5 minutes to share a little bit around crisis management and social media. So crisis management, sometimes referred to as crisis communications or crisis PR. There's a nice definition here you see on the screen which reads, crisis is any situation that is threatening or could threaten to harm people or property, seriously interrupt business, significantly damage reputation, and or negatively impact your bottom line. And what kind of crises can occur? Well, it's things like natural disasters, perhaps like severe weather that prevents the organization operating as usual, man-made disasters. This includes things like terrorism, technology failures. You probably remember a couple of weeks ago now where British Airways actually had an IT systems failure, which grounded many of their flights and actually affected thousands of passengers from traveling as they intended. It could be organizational failures, incompetence on part of the organization, causing itself problems, or even things like rumors, which could be related to the organization itself, or even the senior management team working at the organization. And when we look at the organizations on the line today using CrowdControlHQ, we tend to use the term enterprise social media. And that really represents the fact that you tend to have multiple social media accounts, multiple teams and departments using social media, also different objectives for using social media in the first instance. So it's a complex social media environment. And all of these things can be impacted in the event of a crisis, like we mentioned on the previous slide. So what do organizations tend to think about social media and crisis management? Well, I've put here on the slide a couple of interesting stats from some recent research that shows before a crisis, there's actually 65% of organizations feel that social media makes the crisis more difficult to manage. But what's interesting, after a crisis, it's 55% believe social media actually makes it easier to recover from a crisis. So there's a big difference there in opinion. Comparing before a crisis and after a crisis, showing actually how social media does give you an advantage when communicating with the public or with your customers. And here I wanted to share a couple of recent examples that you'd probably remember. So Volkswagen, with their emissions scandal, this is a good example of how not to respond to a crisis on social media. So actually, when the emissions scandal first broke, it took Volkswagen's global Twitter account 4 days to stop posting promotional content. Perhaps slightly better, the Volkswagen USA Twitter account, they did actually stop posting when the news first broke, but then there was no response or no messages acknowledging the situation, it was just silence. So this is poor management really, and it made the entire situation sort of snowball into something much larger than it originally perhaps was or could have been on social media. But an interesting, Alton Towers, on the other hand, is a good example of how you can manage a social media crisis. So you probably remember not too long ago, there was an incident where an accident with a roller coaster which closed the park. But Alton Towers actually were very quick to post statements about the accident on their Facebook and Twitter accounts. And they replied to messages they received on social instead of simply broadcasting out. And they were also very quick to change their website homepage and acknowledge the incident. And they actually had a company spokesperson ready very quickly to communicate with the media and make announcements related to the incident. So by being prepared, acting quickly and sensibly in this way, Alton Towers actually garnered a lot of sympathy around the accident rather than criticism by ensuring that all of its stakeholders were kept well informed. And here you see an interesting stat from some recent research that suggests only 54% of companies today have a crisis plan in place. So there's a lot of organizations out there which are simply not prepared. But why don't they have a plan? Well, they say things like it's rarely going to be needed, or it's too difficult to set up. They think it's too expensive, or it's just not high enough priority for them. Or they don't know enough about what exists out there today that could help them plan for a crisis. Or they just think it takes too much time to start planning for a crisis. So if you don't have a plan today, what can you start to do to ensure your organization is prepared for a potential crisis, and using social media to help? One approach which I particularly like is this 10 Steps to Crisis Communications by Jonathan Bernstein, which you can see here on the screen. And points 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all really around being prepared for a crisis. So you can anticipate crises that might come up by brainstorming around what could potentially occur. You need to put together a small team of individuals who are assigned to respond in the event of a crisis. You need to identify who will be your authorized spokesperson, ensure they have the necessary training that they need to be able to respond in the crisis. Number 5 is around being able to effectively listen on social media and monitor for the first signs of a potential crisis. So you can actually get one step ahead, and in some cases prevent it becoming a crisis at all. And George will touch on this a little bit later in the presentation. Point 6 and 7, this is important because it relates to knowing who you need to communicate with in the event of a crisis, and what your holding statements will be in the first instance that you can publish before you've had time to put together a more detailed response about the particular situation. Points 8, 9, 10, this is really around what you do post-crisis. So this is where you need to gather all of the information you have available to be able to form an accurate response or accurate responses to messages you've received on social, and then understand what you did right, what you did wrong, and perhaps what you could do better next time. So that's a quick run through there. So George, following on from this, I believe you're going to walk through some of the key capabilities of the CrowdControlHQ platform that are designed to help users in the event of a crisis.
Yes, thanks very much, Dan, for that. Indeed, there's a lot of functionality that should be used in preparation, during, and after a crisis, which we'll be talking about today. This functionality involves crisis preparation, such as making sure that your roles and your wikis are ready for the crisis, making sure that you update your internal and your external stakeholders during the crisis, as well as putting the right monitoring mechanisms in place. And finally, of course, analyzing the effectiveness of the communications plan itself in both a qualitative and a quantitative way. So these are all tips that we will be sharing with our audience today.
Okay, great. So what's the first thing CrowdControlHQ users can do to start preparing for a potential crisis?
It is very difficult to know what the crisis would be, and for that reason, something that all experts agree on and they advise on is to run different crisis scenarios and prepare for it. If there was something that we could see in the example that you shared with us earlier between Alton Towers and Volkswagen, we can see that the difference was in very much the preparation, how quickly they could respond. So therefore, running those different scenarios and having a crisis communications plan ready is going to be absolutely critical. However, here's what we have done here for you. We have put together this mock crisis communications plan in the wiki section area of the software called Crisis Management. That's the name of the wiki that we have created. And as you can see, underneath it, we've listed a number of other wiki pages, all linked back to this one. And these are the different scenarios that the crisis communications team has been running. These different scenarios all include keywords, and this is equally important. You will hear us later on in the presentation talking about those keywords and referring back to them again and again. So these are keywords that people would use on social media to refer back to the incident. It could be places, names, actions, and more. So it isn't just about preparing both your crisis communications plan and those very important keywords, because for the software, those keywords are going to be paramount, but also finding out who are going to be your crisis communication team. Of course, you will have a crisis communications team across your different media channels. Maybe all of it, maybe some members of it, they have to be on social media so that they can take control of the social media channels and be able to update and monitor the situation via social media. So please make sure that you go to the admin area of the system and you create the crisis communications team as a role in the software. Add the members of the crisis communications team to it, and make sure that you add the permissions that we recommend. These are highly recommended permissions for your crisis communications team. And just to very quickly mention them, we're talking about account settings, update all workspaces, moderator, show feeds, sign off, and buzz monitor. Now remember that in order to create the role, you have to be an administrator. However, the members of the crisis communications team, they don't necessarily have to be admins of the software. It could be anyone from your marketing, your corporate communications team, your PR team, and so on.
Okay, so to summarize, I guess, make sure you're using the wiki to store your different scenarios that you think could occur, and then make sure you're using the roles to set up the crisis communications team inside the platform.
Absolutely, these are two vital steps to do in preparation of the crisis.
Okay, great. And then when it comes to communicating with stakeholders around the crisis that might be happening, how can users go about that?
Provided that you have your holding statements ready and you do have some of the key messages ready due to the preparation that you've done, and this is of course given that you have covered that crisis scenario in your preparation, it shouldn't be actually that difficult. And what we are just about to show you is the different areas of the system that you need to utilize in order to update your audiences, your stakeholders, the internal and the external ones. And more specifically, your crisis communications team can access the account settings area of the system. Please remember that account settings was one of the permissions that we deliberately suggested that should be part of the crisis communications role. And that is because by accessing this area of the system, they will have access to the functionality called Notify All Users. That is a very easy to use functionality because you simply type in the message that you want to communicate to your internal stakeholders, and therefore any one of your representatives on social media, any one of your social media colleagues will be able to see an alert, a message on the top of their screen, just like the banner message that we have on the top of our screen here. The message that you want to use here is probably quickly communicating the situation to them and probably even asking them to refrain from sending any messages out or responding to any content before you go back and communicate what the situation is or give the holding message back to your external stakeholders. Additionally, avoid making the mistake that Volkswagen did in the example that Dan shared with us previously, where we could see that 4 days after the crisis has hit them, they were still sending scheduled activity with promotional material. Please ask your crisis communications team to go and suspend any scheduled activity. It goes without saying that this activity can be accessed at a later point where you can go and edit it, you can completely remove it or edit it and resend it, schedule it for the future if you wanted to. But in the time of crisis, you don't want to be seen as if you're sending contradictory messages. You don't want to be seen as in lack of control. And finally, of course, talking about updating the stakeholders, there's the external stakeholders that you need to update. And please remember that you need to have your holding statement ready or your communications, the central message of communication that you need to send to everyone. And you can use the posting out activity of the software and send it to all of your social media accounts or some of your workspaces. Remember that the permission that we chose to use for the crisis communications role was update all workspaces, and this is deliberate. That is so that if the crisis hits one or a few of your social media accounts, this team will be able to target the messages to those social media accounts specifically. However, if you wanted to spread the message across all of your assets, all of your social media accounts, they will have the power to do that through the system.
Okay, so to summarize, I guess, use the banner to update your internal stakeholders and users of the platform. Make sure you know how to suspend any promotional schedule posts that might be due to go out. And then when you're communicating with your external stakeholders, make sure you have access to the right networks and the right accounts.
That is absolutely right. Communication is key in this scenario, and therefore the ability to quickly communicate these messages both to your internal stakeholders and your external stakeholders is crucial.
Okay, sounds good. So then, how can users ensure they really take control of all of their social media messages during the crisis? Making sure that perhaps some normal content can get posted out as planned, but any posts referencing the crisis get sent for approval before being published.
Although most of our administrators on the session today, most of our users, they're very familiar with validation as a functionality, and I'm sure this is exactly what comes to their mind. In fact, we won't be talking about this functionality today. We will be talking about a functionality called sign-off. Probably you remember that because this was one of the permissions that we suggested giving to the crisis communications role. But to do that, I will need to explain what is the difference between validation and sign-off and why sign-off covers more cases. So here's an example here. This is, we're going back to the data leak, the hacking, let's say, incident, the hacking crisis. And a member of your audience, say for example Jane Wills, one of your external stakeholders, demands to know more information about this. However, your crisis communications team have not yet sent the holding statement, or they have not yet communicated what the key message of the organization is going to be. Yet one of your representatives tries to respond to that message with this response that you see here. Now this is the difference between validation and sign-off. The response that the representative used, you will notice that does not include any of the keywords that you will hopefully have included in your wikis while you were preparing for this crisis. They didn't use any information like data, like leak or sensitive information, hack, or any of that. However, due to the fact that they're responding to content that includes this information, their content, their response will not be posted unless your crisis communications team has decided to allow it. So they have to give the final approval, the final sign-off of the content. And it doesn't matter if validation is in place, because even if the content did require to be validated, and after it was validated, it would still have to be signed off by your crisis communications team. So the difference between the two functionalities is that with validation, this content would be posted normally, simply because it doesn't include any of your keywords. However, in the event of a sign-off scenario, it would have to be approved by your crisis communications team. So your crisis communications team, again, will have to go to the account settings area of the system, and they would have to start inputting the words from the wikis that you have already prepared, those keywords that you have predefined, hopefully before the crisis. And as you can see, those defining keywords that we talked about earlier, you can see how they become more and more important. So add them in the sign-off section of the account settings, and every time there's content that requires your crisis management team, your crisis communications team approval, they will be able to see that in the sign-off tab of the software that is on the navigation menu on the left-hand side, and within it, they will have the ability to reject or to approve this, to sign off this content.
Okay, so to summarize, I guess, make sure you understand how to use validation and how to use sign-off. Make sure you know how to update the sign-off words to prevent any of your users publishing posts that might be related to the crisis that you wouldn't want them to do.
That's right, Dan. And being able to take control of the communication in such a scenario is absolutely crucial. You don't want to be sending messages which are contradicting.
Okay. So earlier we mentioned how important social listening is and how important it is to be able to monitor what is being said about you on social. So what can users do to ensure they're listening correctly?
Monitoring needs to be applied both to your own accounts, but also to social media accounts in general. I'm talking about content that is not even posted on your pages. And as you can imagine, we will be talking about two different functionalities here. Dictionaries, which has to do with the inbound activity that your accounts are receiving, and buzz monitor, which is related to the content which is relevant to the crisis posted on Twitter in general. The same keywords that you used for the sign-off purposes, those keywords from your wiki section, can also be input in your crisis email alert dictionary that you can create in the software. That is an inbound dictionary, and please make sure that after you've set up the keywords, you also assign the workspaces that were affected by the crisis to that dictionary. It could be all of your workspaces, but it could be a combination of those. Something that we will request of you to do as well is to make sure that in the moderators tab, you add all the members of your crisis communications team. This way, you're asking essentially the software to notify your team, your crisis communications team, when social media needs their attention, while you're still, they're still managing the crisis on different other channels. So additionally, as we mentioned previously, we will be talking about the monitoring, setting up the monitoring, not only in your dictionaries, but also in Buzz Monitor. And again, you can see why these keywords need to be predefined, are so very important, because you will hear us saying again that these keywords can also be used in Buzz Monitor. You will notice that in this example here, we have created a quick template for you, which you can use in the event of a crisis. So you add the keywords in here connected with the OR command, and then the name of the organization, the city, the place, the person that was involved, and so on and so forth, something that will define those keywords even further. Now, obviously, in this session today, we won't be covering how you can set up a buzzage. Something that you've all heard me saying, probably even multiple times, is that setting up a buzzage is easy, but setting up a good buzzage to make sure that you remove the noise is something that takes training. There's a lot of guides online in our online database that you can use for that, but please also stay tuned, because one of our next master classes will be focusing on Buzz Monitor and helping you to create better searches.
Okay, so to summarize, I guess, make sure you know how to use the dictionary so that you can set up the alerts to inform your crisis team when activity is taking place around the crisis, and then also make sure you know how to use the Buzz Monitor so that you can listen for activity that's taking place on social.
Exactly, Dan, and this way you're covered from a monitoring perspective, both for the material that is posted on the content that is posted on your own accounts, but also you're able to tune in and listen to what is the general buzz about the crisis on Twitter in general.
Okay. And then when it comes to analyzing your social activity after the crisis has passed, so to say, how should users go about that?
Analyzing the success, the results, I guess, of the crisis management outcome is crucial to the success or failure of the plan itself. All content sent or received should be tagged into a campaign, a crisis-related campaign, so that you can then analyze the effectiveness of your plan and your actions in general. More specifically, you will notice that in the example that we have here, we have created the tag, the crisis management tag. You can call it you can give it a different name, but it is, as you can see, a campaign related to the undergoing crisis. And what you will do afterwards is start tagging your content as part of that campaign. And remember, it can be both outbound and inbound. This will allow you, after the crisis, to access the campaign section of the system and do a qualitative analysis of the content itself. You will be able to see what were the messages that you sent and what kind of messages you received and what was the way that you responded even to those messages. Please remember though, when you are creating your campaign, make sure that you are adding the right workspaces, the workspaces that were affected to that campaign, so that content from those workspaces can be tagged as part of that campaign. Finally, if you're not just interested in qualitative analysis in terms of messages and responses, but you also want to find out more about a quantitative analysis of the content that has been sent and received during the crisis, please remember to use analytics. For all of our administrators and all of our users, the advanced at least users, the analytics section is not unfamiliar. And as you can see, what we have accessed here is the analytics tool of the system, but more specifically, we have filtered it with a crisis management tag, that campaign that you set up, simply because in this scenario, you won't be interested in seeing the total number of outbound interactions that you sent out, but you're interested in the outbound interactions related to the crisis that was going on, all that material, all that content that you tagged. Additionally, you probably want to look at the inbound interactions too, simply because it will give you an understanding of the volumes of content that you received during the crisis. So there's 3 reports I will highly recommend using to assess your crisis after the crisis is over. And these are, of course, the outbound interactions report, the inbound interactions report, and the most engaged user report, because this will give you an indication of which were the accounts that engaged with you the most during the crisis, probably by sharing your activity, retweeting it, and of course making it available to other audiences as well.
Okay, so really making sure you know how to use the campaigns and creating a campaign to tag all of the social activity that's related to the crisis, and then afterwards using that campaign to really drill down into the specific details associated with that.
That's right, Dan. So creating the campaign and start tagging the content is the first step, but then of course running the qualitative and quantitative analysis will give you the answer as to how successful and what was the or unsuccessful was the crisis communications actions that you have taken from social media.
Okay.
So just to give you a quick summary of the functionality that we covered today, we talked about the preparation of the crisis, so making sure that your wikis and your roles are ready for it, so making sure that your crisis communications team is set up in the software, they know what to do, and when the crisis strikes, they know how to use the system, but also what are the actions that are required from them. Make sure that you have your crisis communications plan in the wiki area of the system, as well as the different scenarios that you have run in preparation for a given crisis, with the keywords, the defining keywords for each and every one of them included in the relevant wiki areas. During the crisis, take control of communication. Make sure that you apply the sign of keywords from your wikis to the sign of area of the system. Suspend, of course, any scheduled activity so that you don't make the mistake that Volkswagen did, as we previously saw. Use the banner message to communicate to your internal audiences, your internal stakeholders, and post out to one or multiple workspaces from the software to communicate to external stakeholders. Finally, put your monitoring processes in place, both for content that is posted on your own accounts, but also on Twitter in general, using moderation and buzz monitor functionalities respectively. After the crisis is over, start tagging your content into your campaigns so that you can then access the crisis campaign and do a qualitative analysis, or access analytics and do a quantitative analysis to assess the effectiveness of your actions.
Okay, great. Thanks for that, George. So that actually brings us to the end of the session today. I know we've covered an awful lot in 30 minutes around crisis management and using CrowdControlHQ to manage that and the social activity around it. So what I would say, if you still feel like you need some support, then please do get in touch. We can help you with either with your social media crisis communications planning, or also around your social media strategy. And please also, if you have some feedback for us, just share that with us, and we're always looking forward to hearing from you around that. And if you're not already, please do check out our social accounts and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And you can see there at the bottom actually George's email. So just yeah, you know where to find us. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Hope you found it helpful, and look forward to seeing you on another webinar in the future.
Thanks everybody for joining. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.